Okay, this is piece 181. It's titled Petra, and it is in Jordan. It has 3 images associated with it. The Nabataeans were the builders of the city of Petra. In the brown here, you see their empire. It was a trading empire. Here is the city that we're learning about, Petra. I know it's blurry, but it's this dot right here in modern day Jordan. And from this city, the Nabataeans controlled the trade that came up from the south. The trade was in frankincense and myrrh, which were used in Roman uh, ceremonies here over in Europe. And then the Silk Road trade that you see here in pink kind of also filtered through the Nabataeans. They controlled that. They moved further up north, you can see here, and they controlled that Silk Road trade before it went to Europe too. So they were the last stop before Europe, fairly wealthy. Wealthy enough that they minted their own coins. The treasury that you see behind me and that's in this piece was built for this ruler right here, Aratus the Fourth. And here he is featured with his first wife and then with his second wife. The Nabataeans were able to exist in this really rugged environment because they had developed the art of controlling water and preserving what little water rained down. That was, I think, their superpower. So here is a cistern thousands of years old that the Nabataeans would have built. It is shaped somewhat like a Coke bottle, right? Narrow at the top, wider at the bottom. And in here, in the cistern, they stored water from rains. They also built dams and conduits for when there was a huge downpour. So they just managed every drop. They kept them secret too, so that nobody passing through would want to take their water. The other facet of their culture is that the Nabataeans built tombs. You can see this tomb here built out of this lone rock in the middle of the desert. It's quite impressive. It's similar to the tomb that we're going to be looking at. So this is a continuity that they cut into stone. It's also, here are 2 other ones. It's also a continuity that they made these in 2 stories, 2 levels. You can just see how elaborate these are. Can't imagine carving these in the desert. Other continuities is the pediment over the door, pretty small. It doesn't reach any further than over the door. And then they have these pilasters that are decorative columns in their work. Interesting. So we are specifically looking at the city of Petra and a tomb that is actually called the Treasury, ironically. And to get to this city and to the Treasury that we're going to look at, you have to walk through a sick. A sick is a narrow passageway. You walk through this narrow passageway. I think it's a half a mile to a mile long, and you emerge with this site before you, the Treasury. In this city, there were 30,000 residents, about the size of Manhattan. When you arrived, this would be the building that you saw carved into stone. It's called the Treasury, but actually we now know through archaeology that there were 3 tombs in here, and one of the leaders whose body was here was Artias the Fourth. So its function was that it was a tomb. The form here, if this is a Nabataean initial tomb, right, the style that they were pretty comfortable with, this is the treasury that grew out of, or the tomb architecture that grew out of that early Nabataean tomb. And so looking here, you can see, point out the form. We have a pediment that stretches well beyond the doorway. We have the addition of Corinthian columns that are in use, bearing weight, rather than a pediment here that's decorative and doesn't hold any weight. We have 2 stories, which is a continuity from the Nabataean tombs, but the upper story here is far more decorative. We have this, what's called a tholos. It's a circular temple built on top, and the pediment is a what we call a cut pediment. You can see here, just continue these lines, we'd have a full pediment. But then we have two temples, square temples on either side of this tholos. This hopefully would remind you of the Pantheon, which has these similar Corinthian columns, a pediment, the frieze here. So we have similarities moving in from Rome, and there's a reason for that. The reason has to do with their context, which I'll cover now. So Petra was an independent empire up into 64 BCE. So for about 400 years, they were totally on their own, controlling the trade. But you can imagine that that trade would be really something the Romans would want to cover, right? So in 64 BCE, Petra was taxed by the Roman Empire, which was a much bigger empire, conceivably had stronger armies. And then in 106, our friend Trajan, remember Trajan's forum, Trajan's column right here, which is the story of Trajan marching into Dacia in Eastern Europe and putting the Dacians back under Roman power. So that same Trajan conquered Petra. And then in 131 CE, 25 years later, Hadrian, right, the same builder of the Pantheon here, Hadrian said, you know what, I want it named after myself. And so he called it Hadrian Petra. So the Roman influenced, we think, caused the treasury here in Petra to really take on Roman attributes in architecture. Well, the Roman Empire fell, we know, and what existed here on the right in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in pink here, is the Byzantine Empire. And so from the fall of Rome on, the Byzantine Empire controlled Petra. Now, before the fall of Rome, there was a big earthquake, and that killed half the population, or destroyed rather half the city, so the population really decreased. And then in 551, Petra was lost. We think there might have been a more severe drought, possibly another earthquake, but the people, for whatever reason, Petra was abandoned, and it was recovered or rediscovered in 1812. So since 1812, about 600,000 visitors visit Petra every year. So further content of Petra is that there has recently been this dig and ongoing dig, but a little more recently they've discovered some new stuff. And in the archaeology digs, they have found this what seems to be a great temple. It's huge. There's this grand staircase going up, this huge space for a temple with hundreds of columns. They believe that this temple was dedicated to the god Dishara, who was a principal god for the Nabataean culture. And Brown University is leading the archaeological dig here. They recently discovered, I don't know whether it was the left or right side, but they found some seating. So they think this could also be a meeting place, so have some political use to it. And they found this garden and pool complex next to this possible temple. So they're discovering that there were lots of activities in this region. Of course, they get 30,000 people, so it's really a city with lots of this activity. So function, Petra, Jordan, is a city based on trade, filthy rich at one point. The treasury here is a tomb with 3 of their leaders in it, and it had a temple that was used for religious and also probably political worship or political meetings. So that is the fascinating Petra.